of the house. As they saw that Jenny had been killed, the soldiers encouraged the family to leave the rooms upstairs and to go down to the cellar. And Jenny's mother agreed that she would do this under one condition, and that is that Jenny's body would be carried with them down to the cellar. The soldiers agreed, and after much strife, they went through the upper part of the house, down outside of the house, and into the cellar, carrying some of the smaller children, as well as Jenny's body, wrapped in a quilt that her sister had made just a few years earlier. After the family made it to the safety of the cellar, Mrs. Wade could not stay there. She decided to return to the kitchen and do what Jenny wanted to do. She baked 15 loaves of bread because she knew Jenny would want to do that for the hungry soldiers, at all times keeping her face away from the sinister bloodstains on the floor, right where her daughter fell. It's important to note that 9 days after Jenny and Wes Culp were killed, Jack Skelly died of his wounds at Winchester. Initially, Jack was buried at Winchester, but in November of 1864, his brother had him interred in the Evergreen Cemetery, 100 paces from the grave of Jenny Wade. These three young friends were completely unaware of each other's deaths. Wesley Culp died before he could deliver Jack Skelly's message to his mother. Some people suspect that that message was Jack's intent to marry Jenny in September when he was furloughed. Some members of the Skelly family believe that it was a message from a dying man, Jack Skelly, to his mother, telling him how much he loved her. We really don't know to this day. Georgia, Jenny's sister, claims that the family did not know that they had plans to marry until after their death, but the family expected that they would. Now, the news of Jenny's death was carried very soon after the battle by soldiers, by newspaper reporters, by family members, and by neighbors. The very first story appeared in a local newspaper, and it inaccurately attributed Jenny's death to a Union marksman. The soldiers described her as they wrote of their experiences in their journals and in their regimental histories, using these words: genuine heroism, heartily loyal, heroic sacrifice, as they described the Jenny Wade they had come to know. In 1864, a tribute was made to Jenny in a 33-page poem that was written about her. Songs were written about Jenny. She became known as quite a heroic person. Even later in 1913, the Pittsburgh Gazette-Times did a story, and I'll quote from the Pittsburgh Gazette-Times. After Skelly's death, brothers, sisters, and surviving comrades learned of his intent to claim Jenny as his bride in his furlough in the fall. So there were still rumors about Jenny, even in 1913, of how that story might have ended if she had lived. In 1917, the first book about Jenny Wade was written by a man whose name was John White Johnston. He had taken quite an interest in some of the civilian stories at Gettysburg, and he recruited Jenny's sister, Georgia, to assist him in writing this book. Now, not all of the stories about Jenny were good after her death. There was one particular person who spread a lot of stories that were not very positive about Jenny Wade. His name was John Burns, and if you know the story of John Burns was in the spotlight during the Battle of Gettysburg. Some people describe him as a cantankerous person or as the civilian-turned-hero who picked up his gun and fought in the battle. Well, people say that John Burns resented having to share the spotlight with Jenny Wade, and he became jealous of her and therefore put her down and started spreading rumors about her in order to elevate himself in the eyes of people. He was known to say about Jenny, "Charity to her reputation forbids further remarks. I could call her a she-rebel." And that particular reference is to the fact that her father was from Virginia, and there were people who speculated that he was a Southern sympathizer and that Jenny followed in his footsteps. The person who particularly picked up on this point was Mr. John Burns, who had a lot to gain from making Jenny look bad. The story of Jenny Wade tells of soldiers who returned to the scene years after the battle. In 1901, the Jenny Wade Museum was opened specifically because there were many soldiers who were returning to the house where they met Jenny, where they had been wounded, and where Jenny had helped them. So because there were so many people coming back to see this site, the family who owned that building opened up half of the building so that people could come back and take a look. Years later, the museum was expanded to display relics, artifacts, and the original dough tray that Jenny was leaning over as she was shot. There are members of the family today who have shown me the floorboard where the bloodstains were, where Jenny fell. Those floorboards had been torn up and a new floor was put in, but the family kept those particular floorboards, and they are quite dramatic when you take a look at them. Well, Jenny's story, it is one that when you look at it over a period of time, as stories come and go, it's a story that really has had noticeable periods of interest, and then there have been times where the Jenny Wade story has waned. And if you think about it, that's how history really does flow. I'll give you a couple of examples. But starting in the 1880s and the 1890s, that's when visitation really started at Gettysburg. And this was precipitated by the placement of the monuments on the battlefield. And people started coming back to Gettysburg. As a matter of fact, it really became a tourist mecca during those years. Guidebooks, tourist guidebooks, were published by the hundreds. And Jenny's story was repeatedly told in those guidebooks. In the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s, the telling of the Battle of Gettysburg story was told repeatedly, and along with that, the Jenny Wade story was repeated. It was very much alive during those years. This was a time when the tour guides were very popular, and nature will have it, human nature will have it, that those tour guides competed to be the best. And in the competition, some stories were embellished, some stories were really told that weren't factual, and they really tried to sensationalize their stories. Now, not all of them. I have family members who are battlefield guides, so I'm not going to say all of them. But there were one or two guides at the time who sensationalized Jenny's story by saying that she was a woman of loose morals, that she was a woman who spent hours late into the night keeping company with men. And those stories were stories that got a lot of attention because people could then embellish them using their imaginations on how Jenny spent time with the soldiers. I think it's really important to remember one thing, and that is that history is often written by people who were not there. And as I was in my high school years growing up in Gettysburg, I was a student in our history classes. I heard some of the guides' stories. I heard other stories as a National Park Service park ranger. I will say that the stories that came about Jenny Wade had to do with her loose character. And it was very interesting for me then, as a person who began my research for this book, to dig as far as I could to see if there was any substantiation to those stories. I can say that I never found one bit of documentation. I did not find any personal accounts, any stories from people who were local people in Gettysburg who confirmed those stories about Jenny. They make a good story, though. Now, in terms of Jenny's story and its ebb and flow of the story being told, there was also a time when the trend was to highlight battle tactics, troop movements, the officers who were here, which officers made which mistakes, and what their personalities were all about. And when those kinds of stories were at their peak, the Jenny Wade story really took a back seat. And then the movie Gettysburg appeared, and the Joshua Chamberlain story came to the forefront, and the Jenny Wade story took a back seat. There's been a time very recently where out of nowhere, ghost stories have appeared. These stories had not been told until very recent years, and Jenny's story took a back seat. But now has been a time of the women's movement, and there are more people telling stories of the heroines or telling stories about women's view of war. And Jenny's story is now coming to the forefront again as a person who was caught in an unusual place at a very difficult time, doing her best. As I said, as a native of Gettysburg, I thought I knew the Jenny Wade story. I grew up here. I went to the history classes here where they cover the Battle of Gettysburg. My father's a battlefield guide. I've heard him tell the Jenny Wade story many times. As a National Park Service ranger, I told the story of the Battle of Gettysburg. I thought I knew all the details of Jenny's story. But once I really dug into the files here, locally in the Adams County Historical Society, and then the National Park Service files, I was very humbled by the lack of information that I truly had on Jenny. And it was very rewarding for me to put this book together. Probably one of the best lessons that I learned as I did research, specifically looking hard for information about the relationship between Jenny and Jack Skelly, and looking for details on why John Burns would be antagonistic against Jenny. Trying to find information about her reputation. There is something that I learned, and that is not to repeat rumors and to really look for fact when possible. And anyone who's a storyteller, I think that that's an important thing to do. Mary Virginia Wade, or Jenny Wade, was someone who was vilified and she was sanctified in her life. She was a small town, 20-year-old woman who was doing the best she could during a very trying time. And I think that her story is one that's very interesting. The story that surrounds her and her life is one that I invite you to look a little bit more into. And at this time, I think I'll close and see if you have any questions for me about the Jenny Wade story. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Cindy, how you doing?
Fine, thank you.
What is the myth on the ring if a woman puts her finger through the hole? I mean, where did that come about? Is that true? Or is there stories? Does that go back? Is it fact or fiction on that? Or
well, since I have the microphone, I'll give you my answer. I think it's a myth. I think it's one of the superstitions that came about with the Jenny Wade story. And the story is, if you go to the door at the Jenny Wade house, which is just across and up the street, and put your young girl, unmarried, single, put your finger in through the bullet hole, that is good wishes for you in the future to find a partner. And as far as is it true, I'm sure that there are maybe some young girls who've done that who are now married. Is it due to... Are you here with someone? Are you going to take her after? No? Okay. Do you want me to say it's true? No, I'm just teasing you. But that is a part of those legends that came out of the Jenny Wade story. Myself, I think it's fun to do, but you need to try a little bit harder to find that partner and do a little bit more than to do just that. Thank you.
Cindy?
Yes.
You mentioned that Jenny always kept letters from Jack Skelly on her person. Did they bury those letters with her that may have given us more insight as to their real relationship? And do you think they were secretly engaged?
It's a good question. The first question I'll address, the family has some of the letters. The Skelly family has some of the letters. But the letters themselves really did not divulge the depth of the relationship. It was obvious that they were very close. It was obvious that Jenny was very supportive. But the content of the letters really revolves around Jenny encouraging Jack during his time, talking him through being away from home and being away from his family, and being supportive in that sense. The other part of the question was, do I believe that they were engaged? There really isn't documentation for me to say, yes, I do believe that. I would say that in my opinion, I think that they were very close and they were probably headed in that direction. And then what happened was the Skelly family, again, taking into consideration the Wade family reputation, maybe was not necessarily completely supportive of that relationship. Therefore, after their deaths, they talked it down, that this was probably not